Yeah, so Zoom reminds me that recording in progress with a nice American accent. And like I said, without further ado, Uri, I'll leave the floor to you. You can enlighten us today. I will remove my spotlight and make you البوس. تفضل.
Okay, thank you very much. Speaking of American accents, I must apologize then that my accent is pseudo or quasi-American, but I managed to survive 4 years in England with this accent, so I assume everything will be okay today. Thanks again for inviting me. Alessandro and Jonathan had something to do with this, and thank you everyone for coming. My suspicion, well, it's not really a suspicion, I was told this, that we'll have a mix of linguists, and many of you I recognize, and some non-linguists or how would I put it? Language people who are not linguists, if there is such a thing. So I've decided to err on the side of caution and prepare a limited number of slides, and then I know that I know how to speak quite a lot about anything that I talk about. So there's always room for expansion, but I'll try not to how would I put it? Not to overpower the discussion, because I do want there to be a discussion at the end. Okay. Everything's clear right now? Yeah?
All good, Uri.
Okay, good. So I know this is a bit of a provocative title. And some of my friends have told me, well, we know you hate diglossia. It's not about hating diglossia. It's just that I think, and when I say I think, it's my colleagues and me, and I'll introduce some of them in a moment. There is, I call it an obsession or with diglossia. And every time we begin talking about Arabic, it's diglossia. And it's Ferguson, 1959. And I will mention Ferguson, actually in a slightly different context. But what we do in sociolinguistics, in variationist sociolinguistics, is, among other things, we try to treat all languages equally, right? And there's something about this singling out of Arabic as a unique, different, exotic language or language situation that doesn't really jibe very well with this idea of just human languages, natural languages, one of which is Arabic. So some or much of what I'm going to talk about is a result of a lot of thinking that I've done with my colleagues, especially in Al-Wer, but also Bruno Héron and Rudolf de Jong, during the last few years when we were preparing this manuscript. This isn't the real cover. It is the cover image, but I kind of added the title and our names. It'll look something like this, probably a little bit better. This is intended to be a textbook, but I find it to be a little, or much more than a textbook. Really, I don't want to advertise something that's not out there yet, but it's in print. But I do want to give credit to my colleagues as well for many of the ideas that I'll be presenting today. Okay, so where do we start? And we do this in the introduction to our book as well. We start with Clive Holes. Clive Holes is, we believe, the first person to conduct a thorough ethnographic sociolinguistic study of an Arabic dialect. He did so in Bahrain. His study was conducted in the 1970s, published as a, there were many articles on the way, but it was published as a book in 1987. And what Clive Holes did was he separated the variation that everybody talks about between the numerous Arabic dialects, spoken dialects, and what's called classical Arabic and or modern standard Arabic. There is a distinction that we make in the West that isn't made quite often in the Arab world itself. He separated. I hear some echo. If people could mute themselves so I wouldn't hear myself twice. Okay, thanks. So he separated that, not to say that it's not an issue or not something that we might be interested in, but he did focus on variation as it is observed within the vernacular. And in his case, the vernacular was the dialect or dialects of Bahrain, with focus on religious affiliations, Sunni and Shia. I'm not going to go into that, but really this was a milestone in the study of Arabic sociolinguistics. I would say, unfortunately, and I know that at least In'am agrees with me, unfortunately, not everyone has followed this path. Now, it's okay to have controversies, and it's okay to have a multitude of ideas and even opinions, but there's also there is a lot to be said about being critical, not just critical of research, but also critical of the mindsets that we constantly hear about. So I think it'll become clearer as we go along. So I start with a myth. And again, I have to give credit to In'am and Bruno and Rudolf. We all have this. We have this in our book. When one talks about variation in Arabic in terms of a dialectal feature versus what happens in standard Arabic, there has been this. There have been many attempts to establish that there are actually two opposing processes. One is standardization, and the other is colloquialization. Standardization meaning that some local feature of a dialect, and this is mostly in phonology, but it doesn't have to be, that some local feature of a dialect with time has become more like standard Arabic. Colloquialization is the opposite, right? It's when something that sounds like the standard, even in a dialect, becomes different, diverges from the standard. And so two examples that can be given in these situations. One is the word for word, okay? And I'm taking a number of Central Palestinian dialects, mostly rural Palestinian dialects, that traditionally affricate the velar stop k. So instead of kilme, which is what urban Palestinians would say, and it's akin to the k in kalima in standard Arabic, what we have in many of these dialects is chilme. Now, there's also a process of going back to the ka or changing to the ka. And what we have nowadays in modernizing and urbanizing dialects of the same region is that people in areas where ch is the traditional reflex of ka start saying kilme. Okay, so chilme becomes kilme, chief becomes kif, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned in passing that the actual word for word in standard Arabic is neither chilme nor kilme, it's kalima, right? So that's already one bit of one little example of the problematic nature of this kind of categorization of a process as being towards a standard. On the other hand, we have traditional Jordanian dialects that maintain the Arabic and Proto-Arabic and Proto-Semitic, in fact, interdentals. In the example that I provide here, thani, which means second, second as in number two, the tha is the voiceless interdental fricative, which exists in both traditional Jordanian dialects and in standard Arabic. Lo and behold, as a result of demographic changes in Jordan, and particularly in the capital, Amman, what we see is that more and more speakers merge the interdentals with the dental or alveolar stops. And instead of thani, they say tani, okay? So people will say this is colloquialization, right? They take a feature that's perfectly good standard phonological feature and colloquialize it, okay? And we're saying this is a flawed approach. And one way to try to dispel this myth is to look at cases where variation really is between different spoken dialects or different spoken varieties. So an example from Jeddah, from Aziz Al-Issa's study about Najdis. So these are people who moved from one area in Saudi Arabia to the city of Jeddah. These people traditionally had the phoneme or the reflex z, whereas the Jeddah variant and the variant that's prevalent in most of the Arabian Peninsula is g. Now, what happened here? So a word like tiljat became tilgat, which means she divorced. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this, anyone who knows Arabic will say, well, standard Arabic has neither z nor ga. It has qa, right? So there's a voiceless uvular stop. So what happened here in this dialect is that one dialectal variant replaced another dialectal variant. So what is this? Is this standardization? Obviously not, in the sense that we talked about before. Is it colloquialization? Also not, because it already was colloquial, or I don't like the word colloquial. It already was dialectal or vernacular, right? So this is one example. I'll give a couple more. Oops, I have the same example twice, sorry. Another example that, so the second example, is from my own research in Jaffa or Yafa, which is what you see behind me, the nice beach and the old city in the background. What we see in Yafa and some other Palestinian dialects, particularly in towns and cities where there is a high concentration of bilingual speakers, people who are bilingual in Arabic and Hebrew. We have a word like ba'din, okay? Now, ba'din, first of all, it has this voiced pharyngeal fricative, right? But the word itself is a dialectal word. It's by no means a standard word. So that's just one thing we can put aside. But then we look at all the various variants that I found in my own field work. Ba'din, badin, badin, badin. Right? Now, the first variant, ba'din, with the pharyngeal fricative, is traditional, well, the phoneme itself, or the variant of the phoneme itself, not the word, is present in both Palestinian Arabic and all Palestinian dialects, and actually this is one of a number of very stable features of the majority of Arabic dialects, but it also exists in Standard Arabic, right? So, but all the other variants are typical neither of a local dialect or a vernacular or of Standard Arabic. So again, this test that distinguishes between colloquialization and standardization doesn't hold water here, because we're actually shifting from something that is both standard and colloquial or vernacular to something completely different that is probably, well, not probably, that is contact-induced change. In this case, we see Arabic under the influence of Hebrew, which for the most part, for most speakers, doesn't have pharyngeal consonants at all. Another example that we cite in our book, but is credited to Keith Walters. He looked very carefully at the vowel in words like mustawa, which means level, the final vowel. Now, in Standard Arabic, it's an a vowel. It's a potentially long vowel as well. So if you add a pronominal suffix, it'll be mustawahu, mustawaka, and so forth. But he records 3 variants in this town of Korba in Tunisia. I'll actually start with number 3. Number 3, this I've never been good in pronouncing centralized higher vowels, so I'll just leave it in the written form. This is how this vowel is pronounced traditionally in Korba itself. Okay. On the other end of the spectrum, number 1 is the standard Tunis-like form. Now here, when we talk about standard, and notice it's lowercase s standard, not capital S, we're talking about a supralocal standard, right? So we're not talking about the standardized, fossilized form of the language, which is called Standard Arabic, Modern Standard Arabic, Classical Arabic, depending on how you look at it. We're talking about a local, a supralocal standard, the standard of the largest city, the capital city in this case. Okay, and then there's number 2, which is somewhere in between, right, in terms of pronunciation. Now, the tendency in Korba, according to Walters' study, is to shift away from number 3 to number 1, with many people hanging there in between, or oscillating from one to another. With he kind of gave them scores, that when you average the scores are around 2, which means most people either use 2 all the time, but more likely they use 1 and 3 interchangeably, and sometimes 2. But the important thing is that all of these are dialectal forms. So the change, the trajectory of language change in this case is not from dialect to standard. It's not from standard to dialect. But like we saw in the Jeddah case in this variety of Saudi Arabic, it's from dialect to dialect. Okay. And the final example I'll give for this is also from one of the earlier seminal kind of studies of variation in Arabic. This is Nilufar Ha'iri's study of the book is called Sociolinguistic Market of Cairo, but her dissertation was written several years before that, and there were again some various articles in between. And she looked at a phenomenon that is really quite different from all of the ones that we saw thus far, but there is a common denominator, and I'll explain. So you take a word like mamti, my mother, right? So the T, the sound T, okay, is a feminine marker. It's in its medial form before pronominal suffix. So mama is mother or mom, mamti, my mother, my mommy, my mummy, mum. Okay, so she noticed that there are two types of deviations from mamti. One of them she calls weak palatalization, which is something like mamti, mamti. And the other is strong palatalization, which is something like mamchi, mamchi. Now again, mamti is in dialectal Arabic, in the dialect of Cairo. I mean, she focused on Cairo, so we'll talk about Cairo, although it exists elsewhere as well. The t itself is a feature that, or is a variant of it's not a variant really, because t is t. I mean, that's the phoneme in both Standard Arabic and in Cairene Arabic. However, there are these phonological environments, particularly the environment of a high front vowel, where sometimes some people with some degree of social stratification pronounce t as th or ch, okay? And this is just one, what you see here in the graph is just one way of slicing the data, looking at weak versus strong palatalization and looking at women versus men. Okay, I think the one of perhaps the most striking thing you see here is that even at its peak, palatalization of any kind, in this case, it's women's strong palatalization, hovers just above 30%. So this isn't really a change, a wholesale change, as William Labov would call it, in the inventory, in the phonemic inventory of the language. But it is a stylistic resource. You can, and it's used in certain ways by certain people. There's, and I said this was one slice. There's also a way of looking at it, which she did, looking at style and socioeconomic class and education. So there's many layers we can explore with a variable like this, but all of this is really within the dialect. It has nothing to do, or so it seems, with some kind of variation between Standard Arabic and a local dialect. This is all happening within Cairo, within the women and men, the educated and uneducated of Cairo, and we see various patterns that are all within the vernacular. I want to talk briefly about another myth. And this is the myth that has to do with code switching. I won't talk much about it, but it is something that has also been on our mind. There has been, especially in recent years, a lot of chatter about code switching in Arabic as being of two types. One is, and that's the second one that's written on the screen. One is bilingual code switching, which is what we see pretty much everywhere where code switching exists, right? We have, in the United States, we have studies of speakers who oscillate between Spanish and English. We have studies in the Arab world itself, particularly in North Africa and among North African immigrants in Europe, between Arabic and French, Arabic and Dutch. And then there is this new creature called diglossic code switching. Okay, now again, you can say I hate diglossia. I don't hate diglossia, it's there. Okay, but the question is, when someone switches mid-sentence or goes back and forth between either a word, a lexical item, or a pronunciation, or a morphological pattern or a syntactic pattern, or all of the above, or some kind of combination between these, features in their own dialect, and then they insert a word in Fusha, in standard Arabic, or if they go the other way around, if they, they're giving a very fancy lecture or political speech, or an interview in Al Jazeera, which doesn't like dialect at all. But if they're doing that and they're speaking, actually the word Fusha, the word for standard Arabic or classical Arabic, means the most eloquent, right? So there's for many people, there's kind of a judgment called it. So when people try to speak the most eloquent, but they change, their pronunciation shifts, or they're fishing for a word and what comes up is a word in their own dialect which does not exist or is frowned upon in the standard. Is this really code switching? Now, a friend and colleague of ours, Munsif Lahlu, who wrote his PhD dissertation in 1991 at the University of Texas at Austin about code switching, says absolutely not. There is no such thing as diglossic code switching. And the reason is that there is a classic definition of code switching and the code switcher. And a code switcher has to be bilingual. Now, we make this distinction, right, between bilingual and bilingualism and diglossia, even though if we break the words down, bi is di and lingua is glossa, right? But we tend to adopt Latin and Greek morphemes and put them together in different ways, and we mean slightly different things. So when we say diglossia, we typically mean, although there has been much discussion about this as well, we typically mean two and sometimes more varieties of roughly the same language, right? Whereas when we talk about bilingualism, we typically talk about two either unrelated languages or related languages like Hebrew and Arabic, which is what I was studying in Yafa. They can be related, but they are divergent enough from one another to unequivocally constitute or be considered different languages, right? So French and Arabic are different languages. If you speak both, you're bilingual, right? If I speak English and Hebrew, I'm bilingual in those two languages. I don't feel like I'm really trilingual because I always feel that my Arabic is a little lacking, but that's a whole nother story. But if I were to speak, if I had the magical ability to speak American or my quasi-American and some kind of British variety of English, I might call myself bidialectal. It's still not really diglossia, but it's more along those lines. So what Lahlu says is that when you are monolingual, like many people who speak, say, Iraqi Arabic and standard Arabic. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to be monolingual. That doesn't mean that they can't that they haven't studied English, but we're talking about day-to-day life. If that's what you know, if that's what you use interchangeably, Iraqi and Standard Arabic, Moroccan and Standard Arabic, Lebanese and Standard Arabic, then you're not really a code switcher because there is no foreign language involved in the process. There is, I do want to give credit and provide a caveat. There is more nuanced discussion of diglossia, language contact, language variation and change. That's the title of the book that I'm recommending here by Lutfi Sayahi, who wrote extensively, not just in this book, but about code switching in Tunisia between Arabic and French, also between Arabic and the Amazigh languages. You may know them as the Berber languages. We try not to use this term anymore. And this book, which I really do recommend if you're interested in this in these topics. I know, I mean, my whole Arabic repertoire is very non-North African, but I still learned quite a lot from this book. I'm mentioning it because he also talks about diglossic and bilingual code switching, but like I said, the discussion there is much more nuanced and much more sensitive to what it really means to be bilingual, bidialectal, diglossic, and so forth. So I don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. There is some good stuff out there about code switching and its various manifestations, but for now I'm limiting my recommendation to Sayahi's book. Now I want to move on to something a little bit, well, not different, but from a different angle. And it just so happens that I was visiting a number of Palestinian schools today in the Naqab region in southern Palestine. I teach in the Department of Language Instruction. So my students are all, well, not all, but from second year and above, they're all in addition to being students, they're teacher apprentices. And we visited three schools today. In one of them, we sat with the principal, and he gave us some very uplifting stories. And then we heard even more from other people about our students who are second and third year college students who work alongside veteran teachers. And he says, the best thing that I gain from your students is that not only do they learn from our teachers, but our teachers say that they learn from our students. Why am I saying all of this? Because there is dialect influence on Standard Arabic, right? So if earlier I said that the trajectory of change isn't really, when we switch, even when we do switch, or when speakers do switch from a feature that is highly localized to a feature that resembles Standard Arabic, one of two things can happen. One is that they only use the standard features in a limited set of lexical items, right? So in words that are more technical, more political, so a word like iqtisad, well, I'll talk about this in a second. Iqtisad, which means economy or economics. This qa that I talked about earlier, that in some Saudi dialects is pronounced za and others ga. Typically, iqtisad will be iqtisad in many dialects. Some people will vary. That's one thing. The other thing is, it just may be a coincidence that the sound that people are switching over to exists in standard Arabic, right? And what isn't a coincidence is that those sounds or those structures exist in some other neighboring, highly regarded dialect. I don't like the word prestige, but it's in the background there. So I did a little experiment. This isn't a paper that was published this year, but it's in an issue of a journal that's labeled 2020. I picked up some old material that I had recorded from my work on my PhD thesis, which I didn't really include in the thesis because I tried to follow at the time, I mean, I did my fieldwork, I tried to follow the kind of Lebovian methodology where you not just interview people and try to elicit casual speech, but you also have them read something and you do all kinds of little experiments. So I said, okay, let's hear them read Arabic, okay? And then when I sat down to analyze my data, I realized, wait a minute, this isn't really the same variety, right? This isn't just a different style of speech, right? This isn't, someone from London who typically fronts their THs, trying to sound more careful, pays more attention to speech. And no, these are different words, different phonemes. The whole structure of what they were reading in standard Arabic was different from their local dialect. So, what you see here in this text, a very brief text, originally it was in Arabic, in Arabic orthography, but I transcribed it here. In green, I colored, so there's fa, a, ba. These are variables that existed as variables in the local dialect. And it's interesting to look at them here as well. But what I wanted to see was, what about variation that typically doesn't exist in the dialect, but I noticed existed in these same speakers when they were reading a formal text, right? So for instance, there was the word hadith, okay? Which has, in standard Arabic, has this interdental that I showed you at the very beginning that doesn't exist in all dialects. And there was some variation here, even though in the dialect, the th doesn't even exist at all. There's this qa that I mentioned a number of times. There is the ja, the affricate ja versus the fricative ja, and so on and so forth. So there was variation of a different kind, variation in standard Arabic, which was separate from variation in the vernacular. So here's a more detailed account of the variables, right? So fa, in a word like hadith, and thani, right? So this was a very small sample of speakers, but some speakers sometimes pronounce fa as ta or sa. More sa in the word hadith or hadith, and ta in thani, tani. If those of you who are a little more attuned to Arabic might be able to guess why, but there were these two variants where in the dialect variation just doesn't exist. Same with the voiced interdental fricative, the, in a word like هذه, this feminine. Where I heard, well, here there was no stop, but there was hasi, right? Like the S, but of the voiced variety. qa, I talked about this word a moment ago. I see that there are, by the way, I see that there are comments in the chat, but my ADHD doesn't allow me to. I'll look at them later. Okay. So and I have 3 screens, so but it's still quite difficult. And qa, which in the local dialect is and Oroba, I did see your comment, and I have no comment on your comment. Qa, which in some words that are distinctly standard, like iqtisadi and alaqat, there is variation, but the variation here is not between the standard and the local Yafa variant, which is glottal stop. It's ka and ka. These 2 variants are neither in the inventory of standard Arabic nor in the inventory of the local dialect. They do exist in neighboring dialects, but I strongly doubt that that's where this is coming from. Okay, there are a number of 2 in particular vocalic variables as well, right? So the word alaqat, which means relationships or relations, was by some people pronounced ilaqat and some people ulaqat. And we do have e, u, a alternations in the dialects. The first word that comes to mind, which is a very common word, is madrasa or madrase, which means school. It's very, very common in central Palestine to hear midrase instead of madrase. And I've even heard particularly old women say mudrase, right? So, and in Amenai and Bruno and a colleague of ours, Maria Fani, have a paper in Zeitschrift für Arabische Linguistik about a number of features in northern Jordan where this EU alternation may have something to do with religious affiliation, but that's another thing. And again, EU in this word, tijari, tujari, and so forth. Okay? And then ja. So there's an affricate ja. But almost everyone pronounced it ja, which is, by the way, what you hear quite a lot in Lebanese, Syrian news broadcasts. Even though when we teach our students Arabic as a foreign language, we tell them the 5th letter of the Arabic alphabet is jim, j, like English journal, and not like French jour, okay, journal, right? Although in many dialects, many urban dialects, but not just urban, especially in the Levant, it's pronounced as a fricative, and that's what we heard most of the time in this text. I won't burden you with all the statistics. You can read about it. It's not my favorite article that I wrote, but it has something I think a bit innovative in it. I know that not everyone here speaks Arabic, so I won't burden you with this as well for a very long time, but we may be able to hear a couple of things where even when people are attempting to speak the most formal type of Arabic or some variety thereof, we'll hear newscasters reading the news. So this was going to be in Egypt, and there's absolutely no attempt in Egypt to pronounce this same ja as a ja, because in the Cairene dialect, not in all of Egypt, but in Cairo, Alexandria, and in parts of the Nile Delta, ja is pronounced ga as a velar, as a voiced velar, stop. And this has become so standard Egyptian Arabic, standard Arabic, we have to find a word, term for this, has ga throughout. So if you hear the news read with ga, that's it. You know this is an Egyptian newsreader, right? So even though they tell us, or I mean, I used to tell people, I stopped, that standard Arabic unites all of the Arab world. It's identical. No, it's not identical, right? So this may not qualify as a dialect, but it definitely is an accent or a variety of standard Arabic. I'll just play a few seconds of this.
رئيس الوزراء يؤكد طرح العديد من المبادرات لدعم القطاع السياحي ويشدد على ضرورة الالتزام بالاشتراطات الصحية المطلوبة.
Not yet.
وصف 94 شخصا في انفجار ناقل.
Okay, انفجار. I used to work alongside Egyptian lecturers when I was teaching Arabic in the United States. And I noticed that when there was a word like infigar, which means explosion, they would do their utmost to say infijar, right? They would abandon their own flavor of standard Arabic. I'm talking about standard Arabic. And they would say infijar. And I would kind of always question them about that. But you don't see this in the news or in other media that are intended for consumption by Egyptians or by other Arabs, right? So these lecturers that I would talk with, you would say, well, we don't want to confuse them. We don't want them to have a Lebanese teacher one year teaching them infijar, and then I'll say infigar. But actually, even the Lebanese teacher wouldn't teach them infijar, they would say infijar. But ja is perceived as closer to ja than ga is. Okay, perception is a whole nother issue. That's one. The other, this is in Morocco, and I'll focus not so much on reading the news, but on someone who is trying, and we can hear this in the vocabulary and in some of the morphology and phonology, but the person I'll play speaking, while in kind of the framework of standard Arabic, is clearly adding a lot of I call it flavor, Moroccan flavor, to the way he speaks. I'll try to get to the here. This no, sorry, it's this theme.
دراسه يعني كيتلاقاو الناس مخضرمين مع الشباب يلاه بادي وتيكون استفاده على من جميع الاطراف سورتو ملي تنهضروا على السينما الوثائقي.
So for instance, من جميع الأطراف is a solid standard Arabic phrase, which means from all sides, from all angles. And if I only played you that, or I played an audience of Arabic speakers, just these three words, it may very well be that they wouldn't even know where this person is from. Now, Uruba wrote, I did see this again, that there are stress patterns in Moroccan Arabic, and that's true. And these stress patterns in Moroccan Arabic very readily transfer into speech in standard Arabic when spoken by a Moroccan. Maybe just a couple more seconds.
ماشي ضروري غير السينما الوثائقية، السينما عموما لأن فيها أفكار، فيها تطور، فيها ما هو.
Okay, تطور, right? That's so. This word تطور, which means development. He said تطور with final stress, even though, and that marks this person as maybe not Moroccan per se, could be anywhere in North Africa. I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely not the standard pronunciation, even though the word, the register, the context is more along the lines of of Standard Arabic. So just to recap before I move on to my last point is, so we saw how there can be cases where a feature changes from what seems to be a standard feature to, or standard variant to a dialectal variant, or vice versa. But even when that happens, it's not because it's a standard. It's because this feature happens to also occur in some neighboring dialect that's held in high regard. Okay, that's one thing. Then we saw two cases, one with the reading passage and these two quick videos, where even when people are speaking Standard Arabic, they rarely adhere to kind of the textbook features of Standard Arabic, particularly in phonology, but really it goes beyond phonology. It's just that us variationists, most of us are very, very, I don't know, very, very accustomed to looking at phonological features. And by the way, in Arabic, we look a lot at consonants much more than vowels, whereas in English, vowels are much more prevalent in sociolinguistic studies. But and there are reasons, but there are also reasons to diverge from that and diversify the way we look at variation, even phonological variation. Now, this last issue has to do with cases where Standard Arabic is nowhere to be found. Okay? So we have a good number of dialects or varieties of Arabic we call peripheral. Most of them are indeed peripheral geographically, right? So we have some in sub-Saharan Africa, we have Arabic spoken in the Lake Chad area, and in Nigeria, Jonathan Owens is the preeminent scholar who studied these dialects. There are many dialects spoken in Central Asia, in Afghanistan and in Iran and in Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and so on. And I'll focus on just a couple of quick examples. One from Cypriot Arabic, okay, or Maronite Cypriot Arabic, really, a language that is barely spoken anymore. But when it was spoken alongside Cypriot Greek and not at all alongside Standard Arabic, right? And again, we can give a lot of explanations for this. We can say that since Islam was not in the picture, I don't want to get into all that. But we do know that words and sounds and linguistic features that are present specifically in Cypriot Greek, not just any Greek, but Cypriot Greek, have transferred into Cypriot Arabic, right? So an Arabic word, the Arabic word abyad, white, is pronounced abkyav, right? And there's even the this insertion of a velar stop, right? And then the devoicing of the ba, right? Standard Arabic and most of the dialects don't even have a voiceless bilabial stop, pa, right? And the interdentalization of the final stop and its de-emphasis, everything about the phonology of this word is Cypriot Greek rather than Arabic, right? And another example is thiep, from Arabic thiab. Here, well, we're lucky that Arabic also has tha, voiceless interdental fricative. But ba became pa again. There's devoicing, and this ka that just came out of nowhere. But it does. But we do see it in Cypriot Greek words. We have examples in our book. They're all based on research by Alex Borg. And another peripheral dialect, and I know some of you are going to say, no, this isn't a dialect, it's not even Arabic, is Maltese. And the example that I chose here is also from a different angle, in my view, because, and I promised that I would cite Ferguson, right? Ferguson of Diglossia claim. In this same article, where he lays out the groundwork for discussing diglossia in Arabic and a number of other languages, he gives this example where he says there's the verb ra'a, which means to see in classical Arabic. It also exists in my native language, in Hebrew, ra'a. Okay, but it doesn't exist it exists in virtually no Arabic dialect, and the vast majority of dialects from east to west have this other verb, shaf. Lo and behold, Maltese, a language which has not had contact with standard Arabic, with classical Arabic, with Islam, with the Quran, none of that, right? But has developed many innovations, some of which are akin to innovations that we see in neighboring Arabic dialects, right? Like Tunisian and Libyan Arabic. Some of them resemble more features that we see in Levantine Arabic. But here this is one of the only, perhaps the only, if anyone knows otherwise, please let us know, the only Arabic variety that actually preserves this verb, ra'a, the old Semitic verb, even though it had no contact with Arabic, right? And my colleague Maris Camilleri, who's a native speaker of Maltese and a brilliant linguist, has just given us, we also include this in our book, the paradigm. This is just the perfective, but we have the full paradigm, and it's all right, ra, rat, raina, raitu, rau. And you can compare this to standard Arabic, ra'aytu, ra'ayta, ra'ayti, ra'a, ra'at, ra'ayna, ra'ayt, and so forth, right? And I can compare it to my Hebrew, ra'iti, ra'ita, ra'it, ra'inu, right? So look, it's a language that has really been detached culturally and in many respects linguistically as well from the mainstream Arabic varieties, and yet not variation, but the historical change that may have happened in other dialects did not happen in Maltese, even though, and we can't say that this is because, well, Maltese is, Maltese speakers are purveyors of Quranic Arabic. No, many of them have never seen the Quran, never seen Arabic written in Arabic characters. They've only seen Maltese as Maltese written in Latin characters. Many of them don't even think that they speak. They will tell you, we don't speak Arabic, we speak Maltese, which is a Semitic language. Am and I were in Malta in 1998 at a conference, and Rudolf was there too, I think. And I remember the Prime Minister of Malta explaining to us, a group of linguists, how Maltese, like Arabic, is a Semitic language. Okay, even though if you look at it systemically, and it actually is clearly a variety of Arabic, but it has an army and a navy, so we want to call it a language. So I'll end here, almost an hour, 58 minutes. And I'll be very happy to listen to questions. If you give me a second, I'll go through all these comments. I can't promise to answer all of them. Let's see. Okay, no. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Reem, for this. Before I take your actual questions, Reem Khamis wrote here in the comments that there's the impact of colonized research, idealizing nation-state languages in research designs and interpretation. Absolutely true. There's a lot of talk now about decolonizing academia, decolonizing linguistics. I know that Oxford University Press has approved 2 volumes that will be out in probably 4 or 5 years about decolonizing linguistics in various aspects. Yeah, so absolutely. Alessandro, okay, we can talk about this later.
I mean, it was just a curiosity, Uri. I can just. Someone replied saying that there is research about this.
Okay, I'm gonna have to read this a little more carefully, but let's just open it up if that's okay.
The interesting thing you said, and I have, just a quick point here before I open the floor for discussion, is that, I mean, when I teach variation, and of course I explain how, particularly to students who have been exposed to Standard Arabic, how the pronunciation of the tha, the interdental fricative, I forgot all those terms since my BA years, becomes a ta. Mostly I teach urban variation. So what happens in urban contexts, such as Damascus or Beirut, but sometimes it's pronounced like a s sound. So hadith and thaqafa, and it's normal, of course, for students it's normal for students to say why, how. I mean, and I never have an answer for this. I say I don't know. Sometimes
this has been discussed actually quite often, but maybe not in the circles with you, but in linguistics it has been mentioned quite frequently that typically the words. So a word like thaqafa, right?
I'm all ears.
Yeah. So I don't think I've ever heard or will hear anyone say ta'afa, right? You will hear sa'afa, especially in Lebanon.
In Lebanon, yeah.
But not ta'afa, and not taqafa either.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's by and large considered a borrowing or this is where some people will say code switching. I don't think it's code switching, but it's a word that didn't arise organically from within Damascus, Beirut, Jerusalem, Arabic, and so forth, right?
Aleppo, yeah.
Iqtisad is the same thing, right? Now you do, again, I said in Lebanon, and even Mahmoud al-Battal wrote a paper on this about a Lebanese TV station, LBC International, and how they do shift between glottal stop, between qaf and glottal stop in their Standard Arabic, but there are constraints. Not everything is possible, right? Whereas a word like thani is used every day, right? Thani, right? Now the
like numbers, text, like nain and tlate.
Yeah, so the context in this text was kanun thani or tishrin thani. It was a month. Now the very name of the month is fusha, right? It's standard, but the word thani can very easily become
Tani,
or is associated with tani, which exists in the dialect, right? So another example we gave, Inam, remind me, taqrir, right? Taqrir. I don't think you'll hear تقرير or تقرير or
No, I
تجرير.
agree with you. I give the same explanation to my students. I say
Yeah.
you have to think of a slightly more sophisticated register in which the qaf is preserved because it was introduced later. I mean, when you listen to a musalsal, to the conversation in a musalsal like Bab al-Hara, you'll never hear the qaf like thaqafa because they act in a way that in a way that is kind of representative of how Arabic was spoken in the 1920s when the musalsal is set, right?
You'd hear تقرير in Lebanese, and that's right. Yeah. So
you
the
do,
Lebanese
but also,
I would say
also the verb,
the radical.
but also in Syrian Arabic, you would say قرر, قررت, okay? And I mean, what's the pre-modernization equivalent of قرر? How would people say I decided to do something? You know what I'm saying? I mean,
we have some native speakers here, so what do you all say?
Some of these words are everyday words. I'm not saying that this is
I know. Yes,
it's difficult to draw a line.
It sounds like a very casual word, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to draw the line. The same with Adi, al-Adi. Would you say Qadi or Adi? I mean, if you ask me to draw a line, it should be Qadi because but then it's Adi. Okay, I mean, we could go on and on, but or Quran, but we could go on and on, and
we could, yeah, but right. I mean, it's in some ways it's scalar, right? So it's not one. There's no one cutting point. But I think if we do this kind of lexical study, we will be able to find rough categories, and not too many, right? Maybe 3 or 4 categories at most.
If I may add one more point before I open the floor for discussion, just to you, Uri, in terms of how I find musalsalat interesting in this sense, and how you can, I think, get a sense of how people would speak before, mass education and, let's use modernization as an easy word for lack of a better term. You get very interesting examples.
Anybody working for you that you know of who might be using our lab right now?
Hello?
Yeah, someone was speaking.
Yeah, Reem has raised her hand. No, but I just wanted to say that, Uri, I've noticed how there is a qaf, in fact. It's just not pronounced qaf, it's pronounced ga. So words like agid, for example, and Abu Qasim, it's it's a qaf at the end of the day, but not pronounced as a glottal stop. And this is about Bab al-Hara, which is, as most of you probably know, the most popular TV series in the Arab world. Anyway, I just wanted to say a big shukran, thank you to Uri for the talk, for the extremely interesting talk. I will now open the floor. Open the floor for discussion. And if anyone has questions, you can click on the raise hand button, or feel also free.
Not or. Let's do it the proper way.
Okay, that's the only way. Okay, so we have Reem Khamis, she's raised her hand with the first question. تفضلي Reem.
Thank you, shukran. Uri, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you for coming all the way from New York.
Of course. I'm into the decolonization of the study of Arabic diglossia, and because I love your brain and I always know that you have deep thoughts, I want to use this time to ask you about the terms that we're using. We know that the term diglossia by itself is a colonized term. It's a Western way to describe situations that fall out of the norm in a way, and then now we see more cases where there's a term bidialectal, but bidialectal doesn't show the situation of which children are acquiring one language naturally and the other one is more, involving the mechanism of explicit learning, which is very interesting to me from a cognitive perspective. How can we move forward with these studies while also detaching from the terms that we still need to use so that we can connect the knowledge with each other? I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Not an easy question. I'll tell you one thing before I get specifically to this. Almost everything about the way we look at non-European languages is marred with colonialism. And it starts with the very basic things like what we call parts of speech, what we call cases, right? Why is marfu' nominative? Because Latin has nominative, it's kind of like what we have in Arabic, and accusative, right? So, you know, I studied German many years after I studied Arabic, right? And I said, wow, this is great. They have nominative and accusative and genitive, but then like, wait a minute, there's another case, there's dative. So everything, so why do we, and when you try to explain the cases in Arabic, and you say nominative is this and accusative, we try to lump it into these categories that we have in originally in Latin, but then also the more modern European language. So that's even there, even when we talk about the very kind of quote unquote apolitical part of language analysis. We're stuck in with those terms. Even though we have great terminology and insight from the medieval Arab grammarians, or Arabic, I should say, because many of them were not Arab, which by the way, many of them wrote about Hebrew later on in Arabic based on the Arabic terminology used by. So we have a rich body of analytic literature that again emerged organically from within the Middle East, North Africa, Al-Andalus, and so forth. Now, my main kind of beef with the diglossic obsession or preoccupation, to say the least, in addition to the empirical stuff that I showed you, where in so many cases there is no, I mean, when we look in the dialect, there's nothing about the processes going on in it that are even in conversation with the standard. That's empirically the case. But I really, really, really resent this exoticization of Arabic, right? It's like, I mean, it starts from things like, it's such a difficult language to read and write, or the alphabet is so beautiful, right? It's a language, okay? It's a language like Russian, like Hindi, like English, like Hebrew. It's a language, and it has all these wonderful things that all languages do, okay? But let me tell you one more thing. Maybe I sometimes think that maybe what I'm doing, especially being a non-Arabic speaker myself, not non-native Arabic speaker myself, especially being from an ethnic group that is proactively colonizing Palestinians, that maybe everything that I do with Arabic is within this, inadvertently perhaps, is within this framework of colonization. And that when people like me, specifically, not you, me, say, let's put standard Arabic aside, diglossia aside, as I said, maybe what I'm doing is I'm talking down to speakers of the language who say, hold on, there is a very significant value to standard Arabic in our culture. Who are you coming from the outside? Who are you, me, coming from the outside and telling us, wait a minute, what we call اللغة العربية الفصحى, the most eloquent Arabic language, isn't really that important, right? So it's a struggle, okay? I mean, we'll continue this in the next 50 years, you and I, but but that's what I'll say for now, okay?
I agree with you, Uri. It's always a matter of, I guess, juggling between, of course, research and knowledge, but also awareness of the political implications. Thanks for that. There are two more people. The first was Suma. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. And then we have Marah and Uruba. Tfaddali.
A little intervention. Uri, you didn't say that standard Arabic wasn't important.
No, of course not. No. That's right, Inam. That's absolutely right. The problem is, you know, that the nuanced observations that we make as academics are often perceived as not as nuanced as we intended for them to be, right? And the very fact that I even have an opinion about this, or that I purport to know more than an Arabic speaker is problematic. What can I tell you? I mean, I feel this uneasiness day in and day out.
Thank you, Uri. Mara?
Disappeared?
تفضلي, you have to unmute yourself. تفضلي.
Yes. Hi. Wonderful talk.
Hi.
Uri. Thank you so much. It's not exactly a question, but I just want to go back to a comment made by Alessandro at the very last minute about for example, that we hear the g in al-Aqid or like in Bab al-Haram. And I think some variation in colloquial Arabic or Arabics, I don't know, don't necessarily come from like social differences or demographic differences like age or gender or education, but maybe, I mean, I'm sure there are studies, but I haven't read any yet, come from maybe semantic features of the word. So for example, we say Allah, so lam al-mufakhama, not Allah. That's, you know, it'd be a bit disrespectful to say Allah or something like that. Same with al-Aqid, maybe, yes, it might come from Bedouin varieties, as Uruba said, but maybe to give it more respect, maybe to give it, you know, in Arabic we say ta'tiha al-imi.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's studies on this, but what do you think? Yeah.
A comment that I have about this, if I may, is that, and maybe this relates to what Reem asked me about decolonizing the study of Arabic, is that we love simple labels that we love opening Google Maps and looking at the borders and saying Egyptian Arabic, Syrian Arabic, Iraqi. We have a section in our book where we talk about Horani Arabic, right? Now, Horan is an area that straddles today's northern Jordan and southern Syria, and maybe even by extension, some parts of northern Palestine, right? But that doesn't fit our model, right? So is it Jordanian or Syrian? Now, there are features that have shifted towards Damascus, towards Amman, but Horan is neither Jordan nor Syria, and it's both, right? So we expect we expect a Syrian TV show to show us Syrian Arabic. But what is Syrian Arabic? It's not just Damascus.
Exactly.
It's not just that. It's not just Damascus and Aleppo and Latakia. It's every little village in between, right? And and in many ways it's the Palestinians in the refugee camps in Syria. So we need to steer away from these gross. I mean, take our tiny little Palestine, how much variation we see there, and
Yes.
and it's not just north and south and east and west and village and city. It's Christian and Muslim. It's a mosaic that we really need to look at much more carefully. Though the way we look at other, I mean, an old school dialectologist once told me, we cannot look at a Palestinian village linguistically the way we look at New York City. Why not? It's smaller,
exactly.
but
In
it doesn't mean
Nazareth,
it's like,
yeah, in Nazareth alone, I come from Nazareth. In Nazareth alone, you could hear different accents in different neighborhoods sometimes, and that's yeah.
Well, there's actually, one of the things that people told me in Nazareth when I interviewed there was some people are convinced that Nazareth is Medina, Arabiya, Ariqa, it's a well-rooted Arabic and Arab city. And some people say it's really a collection of different villages, right? So, and actually similar things can be said about Jerusalem today, right? Many places that were historically villages around Jerusalem have become, because of the occupation, because of urban, they've become neighborhoods of Jerusalem. And we see this linguistically as well, where Inam can attest to this. I played a video of someone from Jerusalem, and she said, yeah, it's Jerusalem, but it's not quite Jerusalem. And then I asked him where he was from, because it's someone I know, and he said, yeah, I'm from Bet Safa, from something that used to be a village, but now has been swallowed into Jerusalem. So, yeah. Oruba?
Yes, hi. Thank you, first of all, for the great talk.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Very interesting. Just wanted to kind of like comment at the one of the last points that you made, and to kind of like reiterate what Anam said. Obviously, you're not saying that standard Arabic doesn't matter.
No.
It's just kind of focusing the variation on the vernacular, but also it's what I noticed from my own research and from reading other people's research in other countries, that it's often, and I mean it goes without saying, it should go without saying, but here we are saying it, that it's very context dependent. So different countries, different communities within the Arab world, quote unquote, the way the variation happens and is manifested, whether in relation to standard Arabic or putting standard Arabic aside, is very context dependent. So I found that standard Arabic in certain contexts did play some role in variation in the community that I worked on, but in other aspects it didn't. So that's kind of like the point I was trying to make. But also I wanted to ask whether on the research that you presented with the reading passage, don't you think it can perhaps be explained from kind of like a phonological point of view? If we're saying obviously that standard Arabic is nobody's native language, nobody acquires standard Arabic natively, then these speakers don't have those patterns in their native phonemic inventories. And I hesitate to use the word competence, but that they haven't been mastered. And so there's that transfer from their native varieties. I find it personally quite easy to spot someone's dialect, even when they're reading standard Arabic. Like, speaking standard Arabic with an accent, basically. So with North American speakers, it's the stress patterns are the dead giveaway. And with something like je for je. So for me, I don't know if it's simplistic, but it's just speaking standard Arabic with an accent, basically.
It's not simply, I mean, I don't think there is, I mean, what is standard Arabic without an accent? I mean, apart from professional teachers of Arabic as a foreign language, and maybe not only as a foreign, what models do people have, since, as you said, Uruba, they don't acquire standard Arabic natively, and a language that doesn't have
the fossilized kind of like instruction that was passed down in books to us, basically.
Right, yeah,
right?
but it's but that's, I think, inevitably going to be different. From place to place and from community to community, right? It's not as if people have, while acquiring a language, acquired certain features imperfectly, or have these are all learned features, right? And true, some dialects simply have richer or larger phonemic inventories than others, right? Those dialects that have interdentals, for instance, but even they don't have all 28 consonantal phonemes that standard Arabic is supposed to have, right? There's always at least one that's not there, and that's either the or the.
Yeah.
Because no dialect includes both.
Yeah. Can I just add another very quick comment? Is it okay? Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, the Reem had another question, but was it Uruba? Uruba, أنت عندك سؤال?
No, I was just wanna.
No, please.
Another comment
Reem,
on the whole
sure
Aqid
can wait a few more minutes.
Just my perspective as a Syrian quote unquote speaker, that Aqid is used in that kind of like pronunciation only to refer to this kind of like macho man, but Aqid as kind of like a military rank would be pronounced with qa, not ga. So you have even like that same word is pronounced differently depending on the meaning.
In Bab al-Khara?
No, like in Syrian Arabic. So I mean, even now you'd still use Aqid to refer to this kind of like macho man personality. But if it was in reference to kind of like a military rank, it would be Aqid, it wouldn't be Aqid. It would be kind of like directly borrowed from standard Arabic.
But I think the reason for that is that they mean two. I mean, the reason for that is they also mean two different things. They refer to two different things.
Mean two different things.
Was, I mean, an informal, say an informal authority, if there can be something like that. Okay, whereas al-Aqid, I mean, al-Aqid Muammar al-Qaddafi, for example, I mean, it's a modern institution that emerged with mass education, like I said, with modernization and so on and so forth. That's my take on this issue, Aruba. So I mean, I'm
okay. Yeah,
I am amazed, you know, and I can't believe that we're quoting Bab al-Hara as an interesting example of linguistic variation. I never would have thought. That's probably the only interesting thing about the Musalsal, because I'm not. I mean, I watch it, and it's interesting. I watch it, but I don't like it. Reem, اتفضلي.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna thank again Uri. You wouldn't think we're friends, and we talk all the time. Me asking all the time questions of him, but I know that Uri works at a teachers' college, and he works with teachers of Arabic. And my question to you, Uri, is how this research that you're doing and the knowledge that you're having, like for example. Queen Rania Foundation just published a new report, and they're highlighting that the connection between Fusha and Ammi is that they're more similar than they are different. And they are trying to facilitate a change in the way we're thinking about teaching the Arabic for Arabic speakers in the Arab world. I would love to hear from you about how your expertise as a linguist doing the work that you're doing and all of the findings that you're having, how it's interacting with your education design in working with teachers, training pre-service teachers in Arabic teaching. And thank you again for
very loaded again. Okay. I was thinking about this issue when I saw one of your maybe your last comment about the acquisition of standard Arabic through exposure, And while I think that it is feasible or plausible in many Arab communities, it's not an obvious connection. It's not something that always happens. So something I noticed today, okay, you can tell me from your experience as well, when you were a student in school, I noticed when I visit schools that teach Arabic to Arabic speakers, in this case, it's via the Israeli curriculum, but I noticed that textbooks are written in Arabic, standard, of course, with vocalization, with tashkil. And when I talk to teachers, they say, well, of course, this is how they learn how to read the vowels correctly. I think it's a deterrent. I think it serves the opposite. I mean, again, inadvertently, because I encounter many graduates of these schools who have studied Arabic at high levels and had high grades and everything. And then when I ask them to read a text that doesn't have vowels explicitly marked, they're all over the place. They have not acquired this intuition, right? Now, is it because they always had these crutches of the vowels written in front of them? And I'm talking about specifically the vowels that are unique to standard Arabic, the case endings and so forth. And it really calls into question in my mind the degree to which standard Arabic, native, not native, I don't want to use that word, but to the degree to which it has kind of infiltrated their psyches, right? Or is it just really this kind of, is it as foreign to them as it was to me when I started? I sometimes feel that I have, I mean, sometimes, usually, I have better intuition, right? In standard Arabic, and you know, I'm a dialect guy, but I have better intuition than many native speakers of Arabic. So yes, it is acquired, but I think it depends where, how people learn it, what the attitude is. And I'm still in my own job, I'm still fiddling, you know. I on the one hand, I have to teach these courses, these syntax and how to, on the other hand, I teach Arabic historical linguistics, and then I have fun with all the cool things that I know about language that aren't prescriptive. But one of the reasons, actually, that I'm told that the teaching curriculum is so strict about teaching quote unquote proper standard Arabic is because many of these graduates of Arabic medium schools have not developed these skills in a more natural way. Yeah.
Can I add one thing here? I think you have an excellent intuition, and I think it all goes down to phonological approach versus morphological approach. Arabic is morphologically rich language, and we would learn it better if we teach it based on patterns, and you have an excellent intuition, but it's going to take 10 years from now for all the Arabic teaching curriculum to change to be more authentic based on the Arabic, at least based on my experience as speech pathologist. You have an excellent intuition, yeah.
No, that's true. I agree with you. And I mean, when I try to, again, when I try to illustrate very simple things in my mind, right? Like root, pattern, it falls on deaf ear because they've heard the terms, but to see that maktub and mawdu' and marfoud are all the same, this is news to many of my students, and I don't quite know yet how to approach this. But there are a couple more questions. I see.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a couple of points quickly. I mean, first of all, thanks for the, I guess, insight about using tashkil in teaching, because I may say we have been doing it for ages, and I guess it's always been there in the back of my mind that probably there wasn't much use for it, and that we were not making things easier. There was another way to introduce this. But also the other thing I wanted to say, Uri, is, I mean, much as we make an effort to kind of, like you said, understand our viewpoint and where we're coming from, and as you said, you in your position, I myself as a white European man, etc. Many times, however, many of the colonial concepts, or even a colonial approach to language, and particularly language teaching, and we can see this in some of the most widespread textbooks, for example, are in fact, sometimes the authors are not what we would call, external agents or something like that. So it's never easy to, again, draw the line, like I was saying earlier, because some of these misconceptions are widespread. They're not just something that foreigners, let's say, to use another word that we could also ban, and I would be happy to kind of put forward. But I can see that Rasha...
I'm not in favor of banning, but we do need to look critically at these things.
Exactly, yes. I use banning just again, like I said, like for lack of a better word.
I'm banning the word ban.
خلاص اتفقنا. رشا تفضلي.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. Thank you so much, Uri, and everyone. Really enjoyed the whole conversation, really. And it's making me think a lot. Now, just before I forget this issue about the tashkil, I do agree with everything all of you said. It's the tashkil is like crutches for some of the learners, but we never want them to depend on them. And they can be limitations, especially when it comes to issues about variation. Again, many of the words that you mentioned and the examples like kitab and the way it is spelled is probably similar in many varieties of Arabic, but once you put the tashkil, you are limiting how it can be said and understood. No, the issue I've been, the comment I wanted to make is regarding labels, and I can see from this talk, everything you mentioned about the different labels, standard, diglossia, a colloquial, a dialect, a native, non-native, all of these labels, we can hate them, but we can't live without some of them. And even in this talk itself, you found yourself having to whisper some of them because you don't like them, but you have to use them. And I've just been reflecting on this from a bigger picture about identity and other equality and inclusion issues that I have been involved in many things that relate to our identities. We have labels such as our colors or our religions or where we come from, and we use them and we can be obsessed about them, but within each label there has to be variation. So when we define someone of being black, and I know some people hate using the word black, there's nothing wrong about that term black, but what does black mean to different people? If someone says they are Muslim, what does Islam mean? There is variation in everything. What does a native speaker mean? What does a standard mean? What does a colloquial mean? There is an aspect of variation in all of these. And only when we as linguists, as teachers, really understand this aspect of variation in everything we're using, we may not feel as guilty using these terms. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I agree with most of what you said. I just want to say, since you mentioned variation, and I was talking about when I do variation, I do want to say something that's maybe goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, just in case, is that variation doesn't mean anything goes. Kullu mashi, right? It means that there is variation. Things are not the same everywhere, but variation also has structure, right? And while we're beyond saying, Syrians don't say this and Egyptians don't say that and women, no, we show tendencies, we show statistical patterns, but they are patterns, right? Which is why when Alessandro says, so why is hadith like this, but the thani can be tani? There is a logic, and it's our role as scholars to unearth or disentangle the logic behind variation. I also think, obsessing about terminology is not always the best thing, but when the terminology is inaccurate or inappropriate, not in the political sense, inappropriate in that, well, this was observed for English, why use the same term for Arabic, right? It's like, and just to borrow an example from universal grammar, right? What I remember from it is that if there's a copula missing in a sentence, then it's deleted. Why does a copula have to be there to begin with? There are many languages. I mean, Indo-European languages have copulas, or have verbs, right, in every sentence. Arabic doesn't. So why do we have to look at Arabic as a derivative of a language that must have a verb in every sentence? So this is the kind of thing that I'm, I think.
Thank you, Uri. That's great. I think about that every time I see hunaka in textbooks, doing nothing there, just replacing Ilya or there is. Urida had a question. تفضلي.
Hi, let me introduce myself.
Yes, please.
The time it was really great. I really appreciate it. I teach Arabic and French, and I'm from Algeria.
Yeah.
Well, when I started teaching in London, actually, I had email from people which I don't know. Which Arabic do you teach? It was to me, a question which I never thought about. I said, as far as I know, there is only one academic Arabic taught from Mashriq to Maghrib. Now, then they will ask which colloquial or which Ammiya you will teach. I say, I can't teach an Ammiya. I cannot, honestly. I can teach the Arabic language academically. I can make you learn the colloquial or the Ammiya from Egypt or Syria or Lebanon, but teaching it to me, it's going to make you not really understand the proper grammar rules of Arabic. Yeah, and I agree. I teach now at the FCO, I teach diplomats, and I think from now on, teaching languages, we should make a little test to whoever is attending these language courses to see if they understand maths or no, because it's all to do with this formula to follow, pattern one, and later on they don't need the tashkil or the shakl, because we know that mudarris is different from mudarrisa is different from madrasa, and so on. Yeah. But honestly, again, we have a problem talking about the language who is mostly spoken in the Arab world. Some will say I believe Egyptian is the colloquial which is understood from Morocco to Syria, just because of this colonization. When we were watching just the TV, we were just watching the movies of Arabic Egyptian. It's understood everywhere. And some will say no, it's the Lebanese. Other will say it's and now thanks to this technology we can understand you can.
I'm sorry, I got disconnected. I think I missed the last 30 seconds of what you said. I'm sorry.
But you're muted, Urida. You're muted. You need to unmute your microphone.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, thank you for these comments. And again, this is one of the things I was talking about earlier, where who am I to tell you, an Arabic speaker from Algeria, that this is Arabic. And I try to be an impartial observer, but we're talking about something, in language is something that is very dear to people's hearts, and it's beyond. It's language, it's culture, it's many things. Now, from a kind of objective professional standpoint, I agree with you. Maybe not objective so much, but I do agree that teaching a dialect is difficult, right? But it's by no means impossible. I've had the dialects taught to me. I have maybe not as successfully taught dialects to others.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
If you teach a dialect, for example, and they have to sit an exam, where the exam you have to put the noon at the end. لن يذهب مثلا ذهبوا يذهبون, in the colloquial or the spoken you say يذهبوا without the noon. So if he doesn't put the noon, he will lose 2 points.
If you speak a Hijazi dialect, then you will say. This is when I first came to Essex. I remember some of my fellow students. Some of them were here today, bringing a pot of coffee and saying "titgahwoon," or they would say to a woman "titgahween," and I said, "Wait a minute! They're speaking a dialect. Why do they have a noon? It's there. It's not there in Palestinian Arabic, right?" So, if I were to examine someone in Palestinian Arabic, I would not expect them to put a noon there. By no means, no.
Yeah.
There's also the question of, do we need to even teach people to read and write if we're just teaching them a dialect? Yeah, Uruba, of course, some Bedouin dialects. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. My students who are mostly Bedouin do have noon. You're right.
Okay, with your permission, Uri, I think we can wrap this up. I would like to thank you again for a great talk, extremely insightful and interesting for everyone. I think loads of questions, a very good turnout. So thank you very much. Would like everyone to join me in thanking Uri for their talk today, and thank every one of you, for attending too, as the I wouldn't say organizer, but as responsible for these talks today. It's great to see so many people showing interest for such a talk, which to me is bread and butter, but I didn't think it would have so many people today attending. Thanks for all the interesting questions you've asked. They've made all the difference today, and I think Uri shares this opinion with me that receiving such questions.
Everything that everyone said, even if I somewhat disagree with some of it, but thank you so much for your interest.
Of course. So thank you very much for attending. I'll stop the recording now, but for anyone who who wasn't able to attend today, we'll share the recording online as part of this talk was part of the University of Westminster Modern Languages Research Seminar Series. So we'll share the talk again, and hopefully we can keep learning from Uri and such people. Thank you very much.
Well,
تصبحوا على خير.